Hello, everybody. Today we're here to talk about the Maya, but before I get into that, I'd like to give you a broad overview of what this content video is going to be discussing. So, first, we're going to talk about the region between North and South America, which hopefully you remember from your earlier years are the Nearctic and Neotropical ecozones. And we're going to see how the formation of that region and what you now call Central America has really shaped cultures that have grown over that time period. We're also going to differentiate the Maya lowlands and highlands. You'll even notice that we differentiate the lowlands further by breaking it up into the northern Maya lowlands and the southern Maya lowlands. That's important because of the biodiversity and the habitats that we see there. We're going to describe the Maya landscape during the time period where the Maya lived. And then we're also going to discuss how paleo environmental scientists, the people that collect that data, actually were able to draw those conclusions. And then lastly, we're going to kind of just reflect on this kind of broad idea that global ecosystems do not exist in a vacuum. So before we get into the Maya, I would like to introduce you into a term that you may not have heard before called Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica is different from Central America because it is really kind of separating out parts. You'll notice that this kind of highlighted region here is parts of southern Mexico going into Guatemala. Belize is right about here. And then as we move down further south, we get into parts of El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. This is a different area than what we would normally say is Central America, because Central America describes all of the present-day countries that exist between those two ecozones, whereas Mesoamerica is really describing kind of this general area where shared culture was kind of created over time period. And we will see that the civilizations that kind of grew over centuries within this area shared a lot of similar traditions and cultures. So we kind of collectively put them together in this region of Mesoamerica. I should also point out that this content video is really just going to be discussing kind of pre-Columbian time, which is going to be before European settlers arrived to the region of Mesoamerica. So before we get into the Maya, let's rewind a little bit. We're going to go back into the late Cretaceous. Now, I know this might seem odd, but it's important when we think about the context of the region we are looking at. So if you go back even further, you might remember that this whole area was one massive supercontinent Pangaea. And you'll see that as the Cretaceous moved on, which is the time where the dinosaurs were almost about to go extinct, we see that these continental shelves are all separating. So North America has pulled away from Africa. This Atlantic Ocean is growing across this distance. So all of this area and this area was originally kind of connected to each other. What's really important for our purposes is to understand that a lot of the region of Mesoamerica is actually underwater. That ends up being important because the area right here at this point and for several 100 million years before this were actually a series of coral reefs. Those coral reefs are made of corals which deposit calcium carbonate. That's going to be really important because we see that as corals die over time, they end up kind of embedding on top of each other, and that's ultimately what creates limestone. So now let's fast forward a little bit to the end of the Cretaceous period, the time when the dinosaurs went extinct. So this is our KT extinction event, roughly 66 million years ago. Fun fact for you, I was always confused as to why it was called the KT extinction and not the CT extinction. The C actually gets to go for the Cambrian extinction, which was the really first large one about 520 million years ago. So that's why we end up having a K and not a C. And the T comes from the fact that the Paleogene, which is the time zone after the Cretaceous, basically the starting point after the asteroid hit, we also collectively call the Tertiary. So that's where those letters come from. Now let's talk a little bit more about this asteroid. When it hit the planet, it hit just north, roughly 70 to 90 miles north of what is now the coastline of the Yucatan in southern Mexico here. When this asteroid hit, I want you to think about a rock roughly the size of Mount Everest hitting the planet with such force that it was equivalent to roughly 10 billion atomic bombs. So this massive impact, it launched rocks up into the air, into the upper atmosphere, eventually some even landing as far as New Zealand, or present-day New Zealand. So this was that global killer. It did a lot more than just kill the dinosaurs. It also kind of changed the physical geography of this region. So the crater itself has eroded over time. So if you were to kind of fly over the area, you wouldn't see this. But there are still kind of scars left over from that initial impact. We can see those scars through some really interesting scientific ways. This right here is what's called a bourgeois gravity anomaly. It's basically seeing what gravity is doing as you move across the landscape. So to kind of give you a quick rundown of what that is, gravity in theory should be pulling down at the same force all across the planet, this universal 9.8 meters per second. But interestingly enough, when we kind of look for these numbers, we will see that some areas actually have a harder or weaker pull of gravity due to the rock and kind of subsurface below the soil. And this image here is a larger scan over the region around the Yucatan, and we can see that that initial impact actually kind of creates this crater event, and we'll see how this picture fits within the Yucatan here in our next slide. So now let's zoom in towards this Yucatan Peninsula and see how that asteroid impact actually starts to make some substantial changes. So first, let's kind of reinforce here. Impact happened right around here and then left this massive crater. That ends up being important in this area because most of the Yucatan Peninsula, this area all right here, if you remember back during the Santonian age, was an ancient coral bed that is built up in limestone. What's really fascinating about limestone is that it's porous. So as rainfall comes, it starts to kind of make its own little canals through the area. And then where these kind of openings of the trough are, essentially think about this as a ridge from where that asteroid hit, the water eventually starts to break things up and drop, and then you were left with these essentially massive sinkholes with a water reservoir at the bottom. And some of them can be pretty deep. These areas are called cenotes. So when you hear this term, it's basically describing the sinkholes or caves, that have been created over time through weathering of this limestone from acidic water. Here's a shot of what a cenote looks like. And then here is an image of cenotes all within the Yucatan Peninsula. And we'll see these little red dots represent a pretty good bit of cenotes found throughout this kind of limestone area. But what I would like to point out is just the massive volume of cenotes that are all left over from this asteroid impact 66 million years ago. It's pretty incredible to think about how something so long ago is going to essentially give life, give a water source to a culture that's going to be living within this region. Here is the bourgeois anomaly map that we were talking about earlier, and you can see that overlay showing how the asteroid that hits within this point is kind of leaving a crater that we then get all of our nice little cenotes. So hopefully you remember what formed the limestone. Those were those coral beds back in the time before and during the dinosaurs, ultimately creating our nice little coral reefs, and then what made the water acidic. So this rainwater is going to be mixing with CO2 in the atmosphere, and hopefully you remember from your time, water and CO2 creates carbonic acid. That's ultimately what makes these kind of openings within the cenotes. So now let's fast forward and get to the point of the Maya, and I want to point out this mountain range that exists in the southern part of Mesoamerica. So that's there because it is a piece of what we kind of call the Ring of Fire. You might have heard this before. It is basically a ring that surrounds the Pacific Ocean, and that exists because of the tectonic plates of all of these continents that have been perpetually moving away from Pangaea. So if you remember, North America was connected over here with Africa, so was South America, and this whole region was way over to the west as well. So over these, hundreds of millions of years, continents are moving towards the Pacific. So interestingly enough, the Pacific is actually getting smaller, while the Atlantic is getting larger. That ends up creating a series of volcanoes because this tectonic plate is essentially pushing against the Pacific, And that gives us these kind of series of massive earthquake events, and every little red dot here is signifying an earthquake. So if we zoom in to the predominant region where the Maya existed, we will discuss the Maya in kind of three different regions. So you have the northern lowlands, this part of the Yucatan Peninsula, which is now kind of southern Mexico. You start getting into the southern lowlands, which gets into portions of Mexico, but then all of Belize and northern Guatemala. And then you get the Maya highlands. The Maya highlands are essentially all of this mountain range that exists within this region. These are all really kind of separated because of the habitats that exist among them. And if we look at the habitats across all of Mesoamerica, we see a substantial amount of biodiversity. But I would like to point out, when you get into the Maya highlands, there's a lot more little kind of microclimates of interesting terrestrial biomes. But when you look in the Yucatan, it's a lot of dry forest. And we're going to explain why that dry forest exists when areas like the southern Maya lowlands actually end up getting a pretty good bit of rain. The reason for that is because of the orographic effect. So here is a nice little cut of, think about this as like an area of Belize. And let's kind of give ourselves context here. This is a satellite snapshot from NASA satellites looking at wind moving across the Atlantic Ocean. You can see our wind. It's coming off of Africa. These are called trade winds, essentially pushing all the way in towards the Caribbean. And you'll notice that this wind eventually is going to hit this coastal area right here of southern Mexico and Belize. Now, Belize, and getting into the southern Maya lowlands and the Maya highlands, is going to have some topography from those kind of the Maya mountains, this beginning mountain range. As that wind is moving across, it has picked up moisture along the way. And when that wind filled with moisture starts moving up in elevation quickly, it begins to condense. And that condensation ultimately creates rain. The fascinating part is, by the time it gets to the top of the mountain, it's lost all the rain on this side, so then the back side of it ends up being dry. So you'll see parts of this side of the mountain ranges where the moisture has come off ends up being drier than the east side. And we can see that in rain maps over the last several decades. If you look at southern Belize, you will see a higher amount of rain than the northern Belize area, and that's because this mountain range of the Maya Mountains really begins right about here, following along this highway region. So then the next question is, why do we not see rainfall in the northern Maya lowlands if we still see it in areas of Belize? And the reason for that is because the Maya lowlands in the north do not have a mountain ridge to make this orographic effect occur. So essentially the wind keeps on moving without condensing. So that's why most of the Yucatan Peninsula ends up being a dry forest. So now let's see how these landscapes actually shaped the culture during the time of the Maya in the pre-Columbian era. The first thing that I would like to point out is that when you look at Maya ruins, first, we see them like this. They did not look like this during the time of the Maya. They had a lot of really elaborate colors that we will talk about later. But the base of all of these structures are limestone. And we can remember back, that's those coral reefs. So it's really fun to actually sit here and kind of look closely at these rocks as you're moving through Maya ruins. And you might actually see some fossilized remains inside of some of these. That is all limestone. The next important rock that we will talk about is obsidian. Obsidian is an incredibly sharp rock. It's great for cutting, and we actually see that associated with volcanic regions. Obsidian is actually made in part from being in the bottom of a magma chamber. It mixes with some stuff, and as it's erupting, it'll kind of have this own unique little wave that comes out in the lava. So areas of the Mesoamerican region had a really great kind of trade routes established to areas that are away from the mountains. So areas that were in the lowlands traded with people in the highlands, and some of this actually came for things like obsidian. Flint is also another important rock that we will see as a part of kind of shaping Maya culture. This was another kind of bed rock that was associated with marine environments that fossilizes and is another sharp tool. And the last one we'll really see a lot of within Maya culture is jade. Jade is really prominent in religious iconography. It was also used for kind of decoration and ornate kind of structures. And that is also a rock that is created as a part of kind of volcanic regions. So now let's go into kind of a broader discussion of what the jungles actually looked like during the time of the Maya. We could spend hours talking about this and obviously don't have the time, but in a more broader context, I would like to at least introduce you to recognize that the Maya existed pretty well within their habitat. In the earlier times of the Maya, we see really great examples of forest management. They were a part of the woods, they didn't just clear cut. Now, we should point out as the Maya get into the kind of their later times, where the population sizes were growing, there were kind of more concentrations of kind of forest degradation, where we're kind of going into the forest lines. But they also had a really great connection with understanding what things they could grow within that soil. Because hopefully you might remember that the soil itself within this region is actually pretty nutrient poor because the sunlight is just continually letting things grow, so plants are continually pulling those nutrients out of the soil. These were the dominant fruits and veggies that we see as a lot of the kind of reason for being able to grow massive cultures. Corn or maize was a really dominant one, but we also see things like squash and several other peppers and things like that. What's also really fascinating is that we can look back in time and see what the climate was like during the time of the Maya based on cores inside of lake beds. So there is a group of scientists called paleo-environmental scientists. What they do is essentially try to look back in time to see what the climate was like. And this is a sediment core. So essentially imagine a big cylinder going down into a lake and pulling out the soil that's left in the bottom of it. You will notice throughout this massive core right here that we see kind of thicker points within this region. That is happening because during certain times of the year where droughts get heavier, we will see a heavier concentration of things like salt and gypsum actually land on the lake floor. So essentially think when it gets really dry, more stuff kind of collects on the bed. Over time, we can actually look at these cores and see that when we get thicker lines of gypsum and salt, that shows us that droughts occurred. So we can also look back in the time of the Maya and see that during kind of their classic periods where some civilizations began to kind of struggle, it might have contributed, their struggle might have been related to the fact that droughts were occurring within these regions. What's also really fascinating is that inside of these cores, we can find tiny little aquatic snail shells. So this is a little shell that is made from the snail as it's growing over its time period. And the primary chemical that's responsible for the growth in this is calcium carbonate, which is the same stuff that limestone is made out of. Calcium carbonate has oxygen atoms. And here's a really fun thing where chemistry connects into this. Oxygen atoms have varying stable isotopes. The two stable isotopes of oxygen are oxygen 16 and oxygen 18. Remember, that just means that an oxygen 18 atom has two more neutrons. And since oxygen 16 is lighter, it is usually the first atom that dissolves when water is actually evaporating during a summer. So since the oxygen isotope for 16 is lighter, it's going to be the first thing to evaporate. So if you are a snail that is growing in a lake during a drought, you're going to absorb more oxygen 18 atoms inside of your shell than oxygen 16 atoms. Then when you die, your shell is left inside of this core for millennia, and we can go back and then run tests on that shell and see what the ratio is between oxygen 16 and oxygen 18. We use a device called mass spectrometry, which is essentially a little gun that fires ions and then going to heat samples and give us the masses of those isotopes. So, big picture, I want you to think about the fact that we can actually look in core samples in the bottom of lakes and pull up snail shells, and that can actually tell us whether or not droughts occurred during regions or during times of Maya civilization. A pretty incredible research. The next thing that I want to point out is that we also know what food and plants existed during Maya civilization because we can actually go back into the pottery that they created over time periods and find these tiny little things called phytoliths. So these are kind of leftover pieces of cell walls of different plants. And interestingly enough, different plants have different shaped phytoliths. So when we go back into this pottery, we can pull out these pieces, and that will tell us which groups of plants actually existed. We can also find the pollen of various fruit-producing trees, which tell us that they were growing a large amount of these trees when times where they were removing other ones. So we actually see forest management as a part of their civilization. And then sometimes we actually look out and just find the seeds themselves of various plants in this time period. Now, I know we just went through a quick run through, but hopefully you were able to see that these ecosystems where civilizations emerge and live are not just immediately run by the stuff that's around at that time period. It is pretty incredible to think about how something hundreds of millions of years ago is going to shape a civilization in a particular time period. When we start discussing the Yucatan and the Maya that existed within the northern lowlands, I want you to remember that the Yucatan is predominantly a dry forest. It gets roughly 2 to 3 inches of rain during the dry season. So this is an area where water is really needed, and those cenotes are going to keep that Maya civilization alive longer than areas where collapse might have occurred because of droughts. And all of those cenotes were connected to ancient sea floors and corals depositing limestone over millennia. It's a pretty incredible thing to think about.